Like the mess this weekend and the last 10 miles were in a cold rain, and now I'm feeling it a little bit. So we'll see how my voice holds out. So here at the beginning, to save my voice a little bit, who can tell me what the main topics were in Poland chapter 2? Which I asked you to read. Did you guys read chapter 2? Riley is nodding yes.
Can you repeat the question?
What were the main topics that he covered? Start at the beginning of the chapter and work your way through.
He talks about, he goes to this farm and he's riding a tractor with a farmer, and the farmer is talking about,
Who's the farmer?
starts with an N.
George Naylor.
And
It's a farm in Iowa.
it's a farm in Iowa, and he's talking about how sort of how corn became a monoculture, corn and soybeans, and how one of the reasons for that was government incentive to plant corn, and the problematic way that even though the price of corn is going down, farmers will continue to plant more to cover the loss of the price of corn going down.
Because how does this, we'll talk about this more in detail when we get to the economics portion. How does the subsidy system work with the federal government if you're a farmer?
Don't they pay you to produce less?
They don't pay you to produce less. The Farm Bill, you guys know about the Farm Bill? Of course you don't know about the Farm Bill. It's one of the biggest expenditures of the federal government, and the press hardly ever covers it. Farm Bill comes up for a renewal every 5 years. If you listen to agricultural newscasts here in the Midwest on AM stations oftentimes that serve farmers, which I do because I'm twisted, when the Farm Bill comes up, you hear a lot of press coverage on those kinds of stations, but you don't generally hear it on CNN, Fox, et cetera, because it's a boring bill. It has to do with food and food production and school lunches and free food for poor people, et cetera, and nobody is interested in any of that. But it actually ends up being a pretty big expenditure of the federal government. But in the Farm Bill, every 5 years, they set floor prices for different commodities. And so they'll say, you know, the floor price for corn is $1.75 a bushel, let's say. If the price is higher than $1.75 a bushel, the federal government doesn't do anything. If, on the other hand, the price for a bushel of corn falls below $1.75, so if it's higher than that, U.S. government does nothing because they don't need to, because farmers are making a decent return for a bushel of corn. If it falls below that, the U.S. government subsidizes the difference. So let's say that corn falls to $1.65 per bushel. What does the government do then? Covers the 10 cents. So government will pay 10 cents per bushel to the farmer. So Riley told us that the subsidy structure of the federal government encourages overproduction of crops. Why would this system encourage the overproduction of crops, Charlie? Do you have an answer, or were you about to
I
ask
was
a
about to ask
question?
a different question.
Ask a question.
So is this floor price usually pretty low, or is it like a reasonable price?
If you talk to a farmer, he would say it's pretty low. Yeah. From looking at it for a number of years, I also would agree with farmers. It's kind of on the low side.
I mean, it makes sense.
In terms of the amount of inputs and upkeeping farm equipment and stuff like that the farmer has to contend
But at the end
with.
of the day, farmers have something to fall back on.
So they have crop insurance. So crop insurance is a federally subsidized system that is currently subsidized by the government. So the government helps farmers pay for crop insurance. So that years like this year, if you drive up I-29 through Iowa on the Iowa-Nebraska border, you're going to see all of these fields that are normally full of corn and soybeans right now that are just full of weeds, and it's because floodwaters didn't recede early enough for farmers to get any crops in, and so that constitutes a crop failure, and this is why you buy crop insurance. You buy insurance so that if something happens to your crop, you don't lose your farm as a result of it, and the federal government subsidizes that also. But this is different. This is, you've got a crop, but let's say that there's an overproduction of corn one year, and so everybody has a lot of corn. You dump that corn onto a market that has an inelastic demand curve, which is what food is. We don't change how much we eat on the basis of how cheap food is. What you then have is an oversupply. Oversupply drives down price. When the price falls below this floor, then the government will step in and make up the difference of whatever that floor price is. Now that floor price is set every 5 years. It's set in the Farm Bill, and in order for that floor price to change, you have to go back and revise the Farm Bill, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pain in the butt, so they generally don't do that. They try and pick a floor price that's going to be, sustainable over the next 5 to 8 years. Because the other thing is, this is also a bill that is relatively low priority in Congress, and in the time that I've been teaching in class, it's been done every 5 years. In some cases, it's been done every 8 years, depending on how things happen to be going in Washington, D.C. So back to my question, how does this system of subsidizing farmers and their crops to ensure that you're making enough off of your crop to stay afloat, how does this encourage overproduction? How does this encourage what Earl Butz said, get big or get out, plant fence row to fence row?
I mean, it would cause them to grow more corn.
Why would it cause them to grow more corn?
Because if they're not losing money. Exactly, I guess.
So if they grow more corn, what happens to the price of corn?
It goes down.
It goes down. If it goes down,
Government would pay them.
the government will still pay them the difference. So if you want to make money, what do you need to do? Subsidize on a per bushel basis.
You grow more corn.
You grow as many bushels as you
Yeah.
can. Grow as many bushels as you can, even if that continues to push the price down, because if you push the price down, if you're producing more bushels at $1.50 a bushel, the government subsidizes the other 25% of the floor price. The way you stay afloat is by just producing as many bushels as you can. Whatever that does to the price, you don't really care, because the floor price has already been passed on the way down. And so it encourages farmers to plant as many acres as you can, plant them as densely as they can, and plant basically from fence row to fence row. As a matter of fact, in some of these large farms, they've gotten rid of fences altogether. There aren't even fences between the highway and the corn field that is right next to the highway, because that just impedes getting machinery in and out. And also, you have to maintain that fence row, and so there's usually a band of unproductive space around the fence, and so they've gotten rid of fences altogether. This was a system that was put in place by a guy named Earl Butz. He's mentioned in this chapter. Who is Earl Butz? was a kid, Earl Butz was very prominent. I knew his name like as a 7-year-old, strangely enough. Because something happened back in the Nixon administration that affected farmers a lot. It affected moms a lot. And moms got really, really pissed at the federal government. Got really pissed at Nixon in particular. Talks about it in chapter 2. You guys didn't read chapter 2, did you? Riley did. Riley did? Did any of the rest of you read chapter 2?
Parts of it.
Parts of it. Do you remember Earl Butz's name?
Was he the one that developed the new corn jingle thing?
The new what?
The like corn was like able to be planted closer together.
No,
No,
no.
it
He
wasn't
was
that. Okay.
he was Secretary of Agriculture under President Nixon. And you guys recall from the reading what happened in the early 70s with Nixon. We were in the heart of the Cold War with Russia, and there was a big drought in Russia, and the big drought in Russia devastated Russian wheat production. And what did Nixon do in response? At the urging of Earl Butz, am I in the right chapter? Do you have your chapter up on your thing? No, you just have notes. I didn't bring my book, unfortunately. He sold the surplus American grain to Russia. Just sold it. And he did it for some pretty good reasons. In an effort to thaw the Cold War, it was thought that bailing Russia out in the face of their failing agricultural system because of natural disaster, this natural fluctuation in rainfall, would be a goodwill gesture to Russia, start to thaw relations with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened was he basically got rid of all of our grain, essentially sold all the surplus grain that we have been stockpiling since World War II, in some cases, in what came to be known as the ever-normal granary. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about economics later in this semester. But he sold it to Russia for billions and billions of dollars. Russia was happy to pay because they needed grain for their people. And the unfortunate thing is that the year after they sold all this grain surplus to Russia, we ourselves were hit with a drought in the United States, and food prices went through the roof, and mothers were, lining up at stores to try and buy bread for their kids, and they were not very happy with the federal government who had sold the U.S. grain surplus. And at that point, Earl Butz's position was, we need to ramp up production such that we never have to go through this crisis again. And so he got rid of the economic policies that were set up during the New Deal. Actually, it went all the way back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt after the Depression and after the Dust Bowl years. Got rid of those agricultural price supports that were in place back then, and put in a new set of policies that basically were these subsidies where there was a floor price put in place. If crops fell below that floor price, the government would step in and make up the difference. And it's basically how we've subsidized crops since the early 1970s. So FDR, back in what became known as the New Deal, in the 1930s, those systems stayed in place until 1973, I think it was, when Earl Butz, under the Nixon administration, changed the subsidy structure. And we'll talk in more details about, when we talk about history, what it was like during the Depression and of course after the Depression, all the way through to the Butz years. But there was this fundamental change in the economics of doing farming. What else do they talk of, does Poland talk about in this chapter about corn's conquest? There was a guy who revolutionized farming back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because he invented a process. German dude, famous for all sorts of things. Got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the thing that he did for agriculture.
Is that Haber?
Hmm?
Haber?
Fritz Haber, thank you very much. Fritz Haber was a chemist. He did lots of things. He worked on pesticides. So he was a chemist who was focused on agriculture, really. And so he invented a number of different kinds of pesticides. But the other thing that he did is he invented what came to be known as industrial nitrogen fixation. And this is what he won the Nobel Prize for. Because when you're growing a crop, the crop that you're growing needs certain nutrients. It needs nitrogen, it needs phosphorus. Plants don't really need carbon because there's generally a superabundance of carbon floating around in the atmosphere that they use to do photosynthesis and make glucose. So the things that they generally, so any organism needs carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, these are in great abundance. So we don't normally think of these as being limiting nutrients, but nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus are often referred to as limiting nutrients. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are floating around in the air, great abundance. We don't really have to worry about getting those. Nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus, while in some cases they may be out there in the air, they're also in the soil, and plants absorb those nutrients from the soil and incorporate them into the biological molecules that they need. Two of the most limiting are nitrogen and phosphorus, so that when you go to the store and buy a bag of fertilizer, you will usually see a ratio on the bag, and that ratio is the pKn ratio for phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. And depending on what plant you're needing to fertilize and what the fertility status, the nutrient status of your soil is, you'll buy different ratios of phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium to replenish the nutrients that are in your soil. The whole reason that you can get nitrogen in a bag, spread it on your field or in your garden, and add nitrogen back to the soil is because Fritz Haber in 1897 invented a way to get nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it in a bag. To make basically ammonium nitrate. When you drive down the road, when you drive down the road early in the season, and you see these tankers, they're typically white tankers sitting out in fields. They look like butane tanks, but they're on wheels, and they're driven out to fields. Those are basically tanks of ammonium nitrate, and they inject the ammonium nitrate down into the soil. It then gets picked up by the plants and fuels another season of growth. He also made pesticides. One of the pesticides that he invented was co-opted by the Nazis during World War II, Zyklon B. It was used to kill a bunch of Jewish people in World War II. He got the Nobel Prize for nitrogen fixation. He did not get the Nobel Prize for inventing Zyklon B. He never intended for it to be used the way it ended up being used. It was a type of pesticide that was intended to help farmers out. It was then co-opted by very bad people. Fritz Haber, brilliant guy, did a lot of different things. The thing that he's probably best remembered for is this. So this chapter introduces two big topics that we're going to spend a little bit of time working on this week, and then after we finish this week, we'll be kind of pretty much done with biology and ecology, and we're going to start moving into history and economics. And so we're gonna talk about nutrient cycling now, and then after we're done with nutrient cycling, we'll start talking about history and economics. And we'll spend most of the rest of the semester in history and economics. So why are these things important? These things are important because they limit plant growth, and when you limit plant growth, you limit the growth of all the other organisms on the planet. So for the next couple of days, we're going to spend some time talking about nutrient cycling, and I'm going to talk mainly about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. I'm going to talk about the carbon cycle to introduce the idea of what nutrient cycling is like, because nutrient cycling with carbon is really simple. Nutrient cycling with nitrogen, which is actually the focus of Fritz Haber's work, is really complicated, and so it's easier to learn something complicated after you've learned the idea in something simple. Carbon cycling is important for agriculture in that agriculture contributes to global emissions of carbon dioxide, and plants are the main things that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide being in an atmosphere is an issue that we have to deal with here in the 21st century. So we're going to look at pools and fluxes of carbon and nitrogen in carbon and nitrogen cycling, describe the inputs and outputs and transformations of carbon and nitrogen. Once again, they're relatively simple with carbon and more complicated with nitrogen. With nitrogen, there are a lot of biological interactions, plants interacting with other organisms to facilitate nitrogen cycling. There are actually a whole group of organisms called nitrogen-fixing bacteria that do the job that Fritz Haber invented, and they do the job for free without anybody paying for it or using fossil fuels to do it. And then talk about what some of these organisms are that do this, that help with, there are bacteria that help with nitrogen fixation, and then there are fungi that help with getting nutrients to plants because they grow out into the soil. And then there's, later on in the book, there's a farm called Polyphase Farm. It's in the second part of the book. It's a farm that is designed to be self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, and a lot of its self-perpetuating ability is dependent upon their recycling of nutrients. And so we're going to skip ahead towards the end of the week and read a chapter in the second part of Poland's book that introduces you to Polyphase Farm so that we can understand how nutrients cycle at Polyphase Farm, which is different than how nutrients cycle in George Naylor's farm in Iowa, because they're fundamentally different. So this is kind of the goal for, this is the learning objectives for today, but it'll probably take us until Friday to get through all of this. So when we think about nitrogen or phosphorus or sulfur for that matter, the thing that you want to look at is what are the big biological molecules that we depend upon. Back when I was an undergraduate, we referred to these as the biological macromolecules. These are all polymers of one type or another. A polymer is just a molecule that's made up of lots of simpler repeating units. The big macromolecules that we deal with in biology are carbohydrates. We've already talked about one of these carbohydrates, which is glucose. We've talked about another one, which is cellulose. These are all things that built by plants for energy, stored by plants. Cellulose, once again, is just a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together in long chains. Cellulose is the component that makes up wood. We've also talked about some other biological macromolecules. The nucleic acids we've talked about. These are DNA and RNA. We talked about these when we were talking these are made up of repeated units called nucleotides. This should all be reviewed to you. These are things that are made up of a phosphorus bonded to a sugar, bonded to a nitrogenous base. This is how your genetic material is stored, your genetic information is stored. We've talked about proteins just briefly, because proteins are made up of long chains of amino acids. The main reason we've talked about proteins is that the genetic code of DNA gets transcribed into RNA, and then that code in RNA gets translated into a sequence of amino acids. These amino acids are the repeating subunits of proteins, and proteins are what make up a lot of your physical body. We've also talked about proteins in that these proteins are the enzymes that do a lot of the facilitation of chemical work that we do. Things like rubisco and PEP carboxylase, these are all enzymes. As enzymes, they're all proteins. So proteins are important. And then one that we haven't talked about at all so far, except just once when we talked about the cell membranes going around cells. The cell membrane is made up of phospholipids. Phospholipid is a type of lipid. It has two long lipid chains bonded to a phosphate molecule, and they're layered in the cell membrane such that the lipids face in, and it contributes to many of the physical characteristics of the membranes that go around your cells. Lipids are also how you store energy in animals, and so we have animal fat. It's one of the ways that we store excess energy when we drink too much soda and eat too much fried chicken or barbecue. Plants also make lipids, so when you buy corn oil or olive oil or whatever, those are all oils that are squeezed out of plants. Those are all in the lipid family, this class of biological molecules. So when we look at the chemical structure of these things, these are nitrogenous bases in DNA and RNA. And so when you look at the structure of a nucleic acid, the base unit of the repeating unit of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. It has a phosphate molecule, which is the basic form that phosphorus occurs all over in nature. It has a sugar molecule, which is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and these nitrogenous bases, which have nitrogen in them. And so you need phosphorus for the sugar phosphate backbone, and you need nitrogen for the nitrogenous bases. So in each of these, this is cytosine, thymine, uracil, adenine, guanine. One of the things that distinguishes them is you see nitrogen here, here, and here. You see nitrogen here and here, here and here, 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 there, there. So a lot of nitrogen in these purines and pyrimidines that make up the nitrogenous bases. We call them nitrogenous bases because they contain nitrogen. When we look at amino acids, all of the amino acids have a common structure, which is a carboxyl group that is then bonded to another carbon, which is bonded to, carboxyl group that is bonded to another carbon that is bonded to hydrogen, and an amine group which has nitrogen in it, and then this is bonded to a variable side group. So in all of these molecules, there's a portion that is unhighlighted, and then there's a portion that has a box around it. It's this portion that varies from amino acid to amino acid, and that's mainly going to be big carbon chains. But every amino acid has an amine group, this NH3 group that sticks off the side here. Amine group, amine group, amine group. A lot of the variable side chains also have nitrogen. You see this variable side chain has nitrogen in it, this one has nitrogen. This one has 2 nitrogens in it. Some of them have sulfur in it, so another one of the limiting nutrients is incorporated into proteins. So this is another area in which nitrogen is crucially important because every amino acid has at least 1 nitrogen atom in it, if not more. So nitrogenous bases and amino acids are both big molecules that we rely on heavily that require nitrogen in their structure. So when you plant a corn plant in a field, one of the nutrients that are in the soil that corn plant is going to want to be absorbing is nitrogen. It's also going to be wanting to absorb phosphorus. It's also going to be wanting to absorb sulfur. It's also going to be wanting to absorb potassium and magnesium and other trace elements, but the big ones really are nitrogen and phosphorus. So when Fritz Haber went to tackle the issue of declining productivity in farms, the thing that he wanted to do was to work on nitrogen fixation. How do we get atmospheric nitrogen? So nitrogen floats around in the atmosphere, and it floats around as a triply bonded molecule. So when we look at, I don't know why I don't just have a periodic table always at the ready. I seem to need it a lot. Oh, but there I have one. So when we look at the periodic table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the atomic number of nitrogen is 7, which basically means that in the inner shell it has 2 electrons, in the next shell it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it has 7 electrons. 2 of these in the outer shell are filled, which means that there are 3 of these that are available for bonding. And so you have 3 empty electron shells that are available for bonding. So when nitrogen exists out floating around in the atmosphere as two atoms of nitrogen bonded together, they're bonded together through a triple bond of these 3 bondable electrons bonding with the other 3 bondable electrons of the other nitrogen. Now the thing about triple bonds is triple bonds are very strong because they're made up of 3 electron pairs bonding together, bonding these 2 things together. They're stronger than single bonds. Double bonds are stronger than single bonds, and triple bonds are stronger than double bonds. So when you get these things that are bonded together, and this is how nitrogen floats around. Do any of you dive? Anybody go scuba diving?
Once.
Once? You didn't go down very deep if you went once. If you go scuba diving and you go deep, a friend of mine is a marine biologist in Hawaii, and she does really deep dives, like really deep dives. Goes down to where the light disappears. That's kind of her specialty. And she uses this equipment that allows her to recycle her own breath. When you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, but you're also breathing out plenty of oxygen. She has this rebreather apparatus that basically filters out the CO2 and returns oxygen so that she can go down. She sometimes dives for 8 hours at a time. And 2 of that is going to be coming back up. So when she's done with whatever work she's doing down there in the dark depths of the ocean, she'll come up slowly. It'll take her 2 hours after she's done working to just return to the surface. Why is she doing this so slowly? She comes up a little while and then hangs out. Comes up a little while and hangs out. Comes up a little while and hangs out. Comes up a little while and hangs out until she's finally at the surface. She recently posted a picture. She was decompressing at a particular depth, and she has to stay there for that time because something will happen to her. She'll get sick if she doesn't stay there and decompress. And while she was there, a whole school of sharks came by and just swam past her as she was hanging out at her decompression depth. Why why do we decompress when we dive?
Does it like explode? No.
We won't explode, but bubbles will form in our blood, and what are those bubbles from?
Pressure.
Changes in pressure, sure, as you go up, there's less pressure on you, but what's the thing that's floating around in your bloodstream that you don't use because you can't use it?
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen gas. Anybody know what the chemical composition of the atmosphere is? Look it up. You guys have computers, iPads. What's in our atmosphere?
Nitrogen, oxygen.
What are the proportions?
There's a lot of nitrogen.
There is a lot of nitrogen. What's the percentage?
80%.
Brandon, did you just look that up?
78%.
It's 78%. You were close.
I remember seeing it somewhere. I can't remember.
What's X?
Oxygen 21. Argon 1.
Argon. 1%. What? Where's carbon dioxide down there?
0.03.
Carbon dioxide, fairly uncommon. We used to not think of carbon dioxide as a limiting resource, but it turns out if you give plants more carbon dioxide, they actually grow faster. So carbon dioxide is a limiting nutrient, which we didn't think when I was your age. We thought there was enough carbon dioxide out there to satisfy all the needs of a plant, but it turns out that if you give plants more carbon dioxide, they grow faster. So a big amount of the air that you breathe in, you breathe it in, you breathe it out, it gets dissolved in your bloodstream, but it's in the form of two atoms of nitrogen bonded to one another, and you can't do anything with it. So it just hangs around in your bloodstream. When you go diving, the oxygen that you breathe in gets taken up by your cells. The nitrogen that you breathe in doesn't, and so it stays in your bloodstream, and then when you come up, it expands, and it risks building up bubbles of nitrogen in your bloodstream. And when those get into a capillary, it cuts off blood supply, and you suffer a stroke. You get the bends, and all sorts of bad things start happening to you. So you have to decompress to blow off this nitrogen slowly as you come up from deep oceans. So nitrogen has these bonds that are difficult to break. But plants need nitrogen, and so they have to have a way of getting nitrogen out of its atmospheric form into a form that they can use, which is generally nitrate or ammonia or ammonium. Plants can absorb these forms of nitrogen. They cannot absorb this form of nitrogen any better than you can. And what Fritz Haber discovered how to do is how to take this nitrogen that is in air and get it into usable forms that can be absorbed by plants. So why did Fritz Haber need to do this? Well, Fritz Haber needed to do this because over time, soils lose nitrogen. They lose nitrogen in two ways. They lose nitrogen because nitrogen gets picked up by plants, gets absorbed by the roots of plants, and incorporated into their bodies. And the other reason is that nitrogen gets leached out by water. You will recall, hopefully, that water is a special molecule. Has two pairs of electrons that are not available for bonding. It has two electrons that are available for bonding. They bond hydrogen. What's special about water again? Is now some time ago. Wasn't on the exam, but should have been on the exam. What does oxygen do that not a lot of other atoms do? It has an affinity for something. It's on the tip of Brandon's brain, I can tell from the expression on his face.
Isn't it easy to bond with for
It's fairly reactive. What does it do to the electrons of other atoms that it comes into contact with?
Makes them positive or negative to, I don't know. I know this.
It's right on the tip of his brain. He's grasping a little bit of it. You recall the term electronegative, which I gave you? So it's an atom that tends to take on a negative character. Where does it get its negative character?
It's the thing when it pulls away all the other, it strips the...
It is the thing where it pulls away electrons from other atoms. So remember that oxygen has these 2 electrons that are unpaired, and hydrogen each has 1 electron that is unpaired, and they form a covalent bond because they'll share electrons, fills up the outer shell of hydrogen, fills up the outer shell of oxygen. That's what a covalent bond is, where the 2 atoms lend their electrons to one another to make their outer shell complete. They're no longer reactive, but oxygen is selfish in that it pulls hydrogen's electrons closer to the nucleus of oxygen than they are to the nucleus of hydrogen. Electronegative means that the electronegative atoms tend to have a tendency to pull electrons away from other atoms. As a result, this oxygen takes on a more negative character in that it is partially negative. And these hydrogens are both partially positive. Partial positive. So this becomes what we call a polar molecule, indicating that it has poles, just like a magnet has poles. Has kind of a partially negative pole and 2 partially positive poles, because the oxygen is pulling electrons away from the hydrogen, making them more positive and making itself more negative. Nitrate has a negative charge to it. It exists as an ion in soils, and as water flows through soils, the negative charge of nitrate hooks onto the positive charge of hydrogen, and the water will basically pull nitrate out of soil solution because it basically creates these hydrogen bonds between the water molecule and the nitrate molecule. And then as water flows down through the soil, it drags nutrients with it. Phosphate also has a negative charge. Same thing happens to phosphate. As water flows through soil, the water latches onto these negatively charged ions and pulls those negatively charged ions through the soil, and they get deep enough in the soil that plant roots can no longer reach them. And ultimately it flows out into streams and goes off into the ocean and causes problems in streams and oceans, because the streams and oceans are getting more nitrogen and phosphorus than they need, because that nitrogen and phosphorus is being pulled out of out of terrestrial systems into aquatic systems. So water is what is responsible for leaching, but it's once again this electronegative characteristic of water. So one of the things you should remember at the end of this class is that oxygen is an electronegative atom, and when it bonds with hydrogen to make water, that becomes a polar molecule, and that polar molecule can then interact with all sorts of other things because it has this partially negative character and this partially positive character. So, when we think about nutrient cycling, we want to know how nutrients move through ecosystems. We want to know, how does nitrogen get out of soil and into water bodies of water? How does nitrogen get out of the air and get into soil? How does that nitrogen get out of air and get into plants? What are the flows of these nutrients around, so that we can kind of understand, at the heart of it, why farmers have to fertilize their fields every year. You guys know what crop rotation is? What's crop rotation, Charlie?
Every few years they'll plant different crops, like
beans of one type or another. This year we planted edamame, we planted some peas. The edamame did pretty well, the peas didn't do so well. But beans are a group of plants that have nitrogen-fixing bacteria associated with them. And so if you plant corn for a couple of years, the corn removes nitrogen from the soil. When you harvest that corn, you remove those plants from the landscape, carrying all that nitrogen with them. You're depleting nitrogen over a couple of years. And so every couple of years, you'll take that cornfield and instead of planting corn in it, you'll plant soybeans. When you harvest the soybeans, you harvest a lot of the above ground biomass, but the bacteria that do the nitrogen fixing are actually in the roots. And when you're done harvesting those plants, you'll plow those plants under, and those plants will replenish the nitrogen, and then the next year you can go and plant corn back in that field, and you'll have a healthier corn crop than you had in 2 years before because you planted soybeans in the intervening year. This crop rotation is done to replenish nutrients that are removed from the soil through the process of farming, of agriculture. So 2 things that you need to think about when you think about this are pools. Pools are large areas that kind of serve as repositories for nutrients. So on a farm, the soil would be a pool. The atmosphere would be another pool, and a flux would be the movement of a nutrient from the atmosphere to the soil. So pools are where nutrients go and hang out, in a way, and fluxes are nutrients moving from one place to hang out to another place to hang out. So nitrogen hangs out in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide hangs out in the atmosphere. During nitrogen fixation, nitrogen moves from the atmosphere to the pool that is plant biomass. During photosynthesis, carbon dioxide moves from the pool that is the atmosphere to the pool that is plant biomass. And so pools are where quantities are stored, fluxes are flows between pools, and the cycle is the collection of all of these pools and fluxes. So when you think about any cycle, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus or carbon, you have pool 1 and pool 2. Flux 1 might be going from pool 1 to pool 2. Flux 2 might be going from pool 2 to pool 1. We'll put names on what these fluxes are. This is a really simple cycle. Cycles can be more complicated. And notice that you can have fluxes that are one way between pool 1 and pool 2, but you can have a pool that goes from pool 3 to pool 4 and a flux that goes the opposite direction from pool 4 to pool 3. It all just depends on what the details of the system are. So fluxes can be classified as inputs. This flux would be an input into pool 2, but it would be an output from pool 1. Sometimes these fluxes just involve the nutrient moving from one place to another in its current form, but sometimes that movement of the nutrient involves a transformation. So in the case of going from atmospheric nitrogen to nitrate, this is not only a flux, but it's a particular flux. It's an output from whatever the pool is that is holding atmospheric nitrogen. It's an input into whatever the pool is that holds nitrate, and it's also a transformation because it changes form. It's going from one form to another form. And you've already studied some of these transformations. Carbon dioxide undergoes a transformation when it's taken out of the atmosphere, incorporated into the plant biomass by photosynthesis in the form of carbon dioxide, or in the form of glucose rather. So this process of taking carbon dioxide and transforming it into glucose is also a transformation. But it's also an output from the atmosphere, and it's an input into plant biomass. And it's a transformation because it has changed forms. This is just what these terms mean. So let's talk about carbon, because carbon is simple. in terms of its cycling. Two big fluxes that are involved are also transformations. So a flux from, for example, atmosphere to plants involves the conversion, the transformation of carbon dioxide into glucose. This is held in the atmosphere, this is held in plant bodies. Now, plants can be eaten by animals, but the animals are basically just eating the plants to get the glucose that's in the plants. So there's no transformation in consumption, but then what we do is we take that glucose and we break it down. We take the chemical energy that is stored in the bonds of glucose, we break those bonds apart using oxygen, and we release carbon dioxide and water, low energy byproducts of taking the high energy glucose, breaking it down, releasing the energy that is in glucose. And so this is the process of photosynthesis, this is the process of cellular respiration, and they're basically kind of opposites of one another. Taking energy from the sun to put together lots of molecules of carbon dioxide into molecules of glucose, storing energy, taking stored energy, combining it with oxygen to release energy that we use to power going to ecology of food class. These are the two major transformations of carbon. There are a lot of other transformations of carbon, which is why we start with carbon, because it's simpler, it's easier in some ways. So one way to think of a nutrient cycle is to draw a diagram. So a friend of mine a number of years ago presented it to me this way, and I think it's a pretty intuitive way, so I stole it from her. One way to think of the world is that everything is existing on the surface of soil or underneath the surface of soil. We live above the surface of soil. Bacteria and insects and things like that live below the soil as well as above the soil. So we could divide into two big categories the organisms that live on top of the soil. One of those groups of organisms would be animals, but another one of those groups of organisms would be plants. But do plants only live on top of the soil? Many.
No, they live under the soil too.
They live under the soil also. So when I talk about plants living above the soil, what part of the plant am I talking about? Remember we made this distinction between the above ground portion of plants and the below ground portion of plants?
The root and the shoot.
The root and the shoot. So we've already started defining some things in more specific sorts of ways. Animals, we'll just think of them as living above ground because there are ones that live below ground, but just for the purposes of thinking about cycling. What would be another? So these are all pools. The soil is a pool, the animals are a pool, the plants are a pool. What are other pools? Places where nutrients are stored. I've talked about one a lot, the atmosphere. So we can think of a pool being the atmosphere. If we're talking about a terrestrial ecosystem, what can happen to these nutrients over time in this terrestrial ecosystem? They get cycled around among plants and animals and soil and stuff, but what else can happen to them? Has to do with water, which is a polar molecule, which does what to nutrients?
Takes them out of soil.
In the form of?
In the form of,
The water pulls it through the soil, pulls it out of the soil into what? Ultimately, when water goes through the soil, where does it end up? In streams that then ultimately flow to the ocean. So you can also have outputs from the soil into either groundwater or stream flow, where it's now leaving the ecosystem and flowing into another ecosystem somewhere. So these are kind of the big fundamental pools for any nutrient that you might be interested in tearing apart and looking at. What is the form of carbon in the atmosphere? Main form of carbon in the atmosphere?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. What's the main form of carbon in plant bodies? Main form. There are lots of forms, but the big primary one is
Same thing.
no.
Carboxylase.
No. How do we get carbon dioxide into plants through the process of photosynthesis? The equation was just on the board, but I erased it,
C6H12O6.
which is glucose. So, what is photosynthesis? It is an output from the atmosphere being input into plant bodies, and it is a fluxes can be called inputs, outputs, or transformations. It's transformation because we went from carbon dioxide to glucose. So it's an output out of the atmosphere into plants. This is a flux that is also a transformation because we went from CO2 to C6H12O6. Different forms of carbon. Low energy carbon in the atmosphere, high energy carbon stored in plants. Do plants pick up carbon out of the soil? No, they suck it in through their stomata and their leaves. So there's not a lot of assimilation of carbon out of the soil. What happens to plants when they die?
Do they release all of it?
They will, but where will they release it? When a tree falls in the forest, where does it fall? On the ground, and then it starts what process? You guys ever watch crime shows? This happens to human bodies also. They decompose. So this process of death, now we're going to get a little grim here. Death takes carbon out of the living biomass pool here and puts it into dissolved organic carbon. Carbon that is now a part of soil, and once it's in here as carbon, well, we'll just put it in here. We'll say soil carbon. That's also in the form of glucose. So no transformation has happened. You just went from living glucose to dead glucose. But then, what's in the soil that's going to actually do the process of decomposition? Bugs in some cases, and this one I'm thinking of is largely responsible for decomp. Time's not an organism. Nitrogen's not an organism either. It's a nutrient or an atom.
Larvae.
So larvae, those would be bugs, and bugs are certainly responsible for a lot of decomposition. Bacteria are hugely responsible for decomposition. And so we could put a box here that represents decomp. And we need to remember that the things doing the decomp are bacteria that are in the soil. That converts the soil carbon from glucose into carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide leaves the soil and goes back to the atmosphere. This is ultimately labeled soil respiration, because it looks like the soil is breathing out carbon dioxide in the same way that we breathe out carbon dioxide. All the bacteria are doing is taking glucose, breaking it down to get the energy out of it, and releasing carbon dioxide at the end. They're doing the same form of cellular respiration that we do, even though they're bacteria and we're human beings. So the soil respiration returns carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Do animals also die? Yep, They go through the same process. They go into soil carbon. The soil carbon gets broken down to produce CO2. That CO2 goes back to the atmosphere. Yeah.
So when a tree falls down and dies, and then bacteria decompose it, it's just the amount of CO2 that's already present in that tree that gets released.
So for every molecule of glucose, it will release 6 molecules of CO2 back to the atmosphere.
And so does it take 6 molecules of
Take 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to make a glucose molecule, and so when you break down that glucose, it will release those 6 molecules of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Yep, exactly. So this is basically the carbon cycle in many ways. So then the question is, how much carbon is in all of these places? I'm going to express carbon in 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year for these fluxes. That's a ton, like that's a lot of carbon. 10 to the 15th grams. So you know what 10 to the 15th is, right? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's what 10 to the 15th is. In the atmosphere, there are 760 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon hanging out in the atmosphere. So that would be this much carbon just hanging out in the atmosphere. That's how much carbon is out there when carbon dioxide only makes up 0.03% of the composition of the atmosphere. 60 times 10 to the 15th, sorry, my bad, 120. 120 of this 760 every year comes down and gets incorporated into plants through the process of photosynthesis. What flux have we left out? We have the flux of bacteria doing cellular respiration. What flux have we left out? Do plants do cellular respiration? Of course, why are they doing photosynthesis in the first place? To get energy to do cellular respiration. Do animals do cellular respiration? Yep. So coming from animals and plants, there is cellular respiration that ends up being about 60 times 10 to the 15th grams per year. There's also plants being eaten by animals. We won't worry about that because all of this is eventually going to die and go into the soil. When it gets broken down by soil and converted to CO2, we return about 55 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year. So if we add all of this up, we get 120 put into we return 60 to the atmosphere through respiration of organisms not in soil, and we return 55 in the form of soil respiration back to the atmosphere, which means we have 5 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year stored in soil, essentially, because that's where it is. This 55 comes out, which there should be 60 coming in, because there's 60 coming in from photosynthesis, 60 going back out, which means the other 60 must go into soil, which means that 55 gets put into soil. Grams of carbon per year. So not 55, rather, 5 gets stored in soil. So terrestrial systems should, over time, store soil. On Wednesday, we'll explore why terrestrial ecosystems don't store soil. But this is a productive way of thinking about nutrient cycling. Draw the pools, then figure out what the fluxes are.